All right, up next, let's talk about working with strings a little more, in a little more detail. This is one of the things that when someone gets into composition, especially film scoring, I see that they latch onto first, and with the most vigor. People really associate a big, lush orchestra with film soundtracks. And that can be true and not true. It's true in the big budget Hollywood stuff. Like it has to have a big orchestra. Mostly because historically you can kind of all draw that back to Holst, the composer Holst and the Planets. A lot of film scoring, that big Hollywood sound of film scoring, is influenced by the Holst Planets pieces. That's why you get those big horns and all that other stuff. But I won't go into that too much. That's a very opinionated statement. Well, not super opinionated, but pretty opinionated statement. But I encourage you to check out that piece. The Planets is the name of the piece by Holst. Anyway, so when we hear these big Hollywood movie soundtracks, we associate this big string section. And I've already talked about doing that digitally with sampled strings. And one thing we could go into is how to convert your sampled string orchestra into a real string orchestra. That's something that can be done. It's tricky because there's a lot that goes into that. First, you have to notate everything in traditional notation. That's not extremely difficult, but then you have to make parts. You have to make sure everything is notated in a very clear way. You have to make a different part for each player. You have to make a score for the conductor. And then the hardest part, you have to get an orchestra. So we're not going to go into a huge amount of details on how to do that. That's a whole separate class. But I will, while we're on the topic, I will tell you that what a lot of people end up doing is you can't just take an orchestra piece, whether it's for a film or just music on its own. You can't just take it to your local neighborhood orchestra and say, play it, if they're a professional orchestra. They schedule their rehearsals and everything 2-3 years ahead of time. So they don't just do that. But what you can do is if you have some money, you can go to somewhere like Prague. There is an orchestra in Prague. I can't remember the name of it, if it's the Czech Philharmonic or what, but you can just hire them for not an insane amount of money. I mean, it's expensive, but relative to hiring an American orchestra, it's fairly cheap. I want to say it's in the ballpark of like $5,000 to do a full recording session. That's really cheap as compared to what it would cost you here in the US. So that's something that a lot of people do. So keep that in mind. But for now, let's focus on how to actually write for strings well. So what I'm talking about in this section is, let's say we have a melody, like a lush melody that we love, and we want to add orchestra to accompany that melody, to fill it out, to make it bigger and thicker. There's a couple different ways we do that. I'm going to kind of boil this down into 3 different techniques we can use to fill out that sound. And those techniques are polyrhythmic, monorhythmic, and accompanimental. Let's go over those 3 terms in a little more detail in the next video, and then we'll dive into some examples and working on a piece that uses this technique of building a big, lush orchestra sound.